An 8-year-old girl walked to Bible school on a quiet summer morning. She never made it. For nearly 50 years, no one knew who took her. Until a pastor confessed. But when the case finally went to trial, the jury said he was innocent. So now there's only one question left. If the man who confessed didn't do it, then who killed Gretchen Harrington? This is the case of Gretchen Harrington. A case that sat unsolved for nearly 50 years. A case that was cracked open not by modern forensics, not by a detective, not by a database, but by a diary. Written by a 10-year-old girl. In the careful handwriting of a child who had no one safe to tell. Welcome to Cold Case Vault. And before we go any further, if you are new here, this channel exists for one reason: to make sure the cases that history forgot are never truly forgotten. We research every single case for weeks before we bring it to you, because every one of these stories deserves to be told right. So hit that subscribe button right now and ring that bell. We drop a new case every single week, and trust us, you do not want to miss what is coming. Now let us get into it. Broomall, Pennsylvania. 1975. To understand what happened in that town on the 15th of August, you first have to understand what Broomall was. It was not a complicated place. It was a quiet, tree-lined suburb sitting just outside Philadelphia, the kind of community that families had deliberately chosen. They had packed up from the city and planted themselves on these peaceful streets specifically because of the feeling Broomall gave them. The feeling that their children were safe here. That danger was something that happened somewhere else, to someone else's family. Parents waved goodbye from front porches and expected their kids back at dinner time. No tracking apps. No check-in calls. No fear. That sense of safety was not naive. It had been built and reinforced through years, decades, of absolutely nothing ever going wrong. That was the world Gretchen Harrington had grown up inside of. Gretchen was 8 years old, the third of 4 daughters born to Harold and Anna Harrington. Harold was a pastor, steady, devoted, the kind of man whose whole life ran on faith and routine. Anna kept the household together, sewed the girls' clothes by hand, held everything close. By every account from every person who knew them, they were simply good people living a quiet and faithful life. Nothing unusual. Nothing complicated. Just good. And Gretchen fit that life perfectly. She was the kind of child who collected friends without trying. Private school classmates, public school neighbors, kids from church, it did not matter who you were or where you came from. Gretchen wanted to know you. Her sister and later said she did not have a mean streak in her body. Her best friend said they never once had a single fight. She was that kind of kid. The kind that people remember for the rest of their lives. And Gretchen had one thing she was particularly proud of that summer: a perfect attendance record at Bible school. Not a single day missed all week. This was the last day of the program. The day they handed out the attendance certificates. Now here is where the morning starts to become something different. Because that same morning, something beautiful was happening inside the Harrington home. Anna was being discharged from the hospital. She was coming home with baby Jessica, the newest Harrington daughter. The whole house was buzzing with that particular anticipation that only a new baby can create. 12-year-old Zoe and 11-year-old Harriet decided to stay home and wait for their mother. That was the obvious choice. The natural one. It would have made complete sense for Gretchen to stay too. But Harold believed in showing up. He believed in honoring your commitments, in doing what you said you were going to do. So he looked at his 8-year-old daughter and told her, "Go. Keep the streak. It is less than half a mile. You have walked it every single day this week." Gretchen agreed. She picked up her Bible. She got dressed in her usual way, stripes with plaid, colors that clashed in the way that only a child who genuinely does not care about matching can pull off, because to Gretchen it simply did not matter. She was going to church, not a fashion show, and she loved herself exactly as she was. She headed for the door. Harold stepped outside to watch her go. He stood there on that front step as she started up the hill on Lawrence Road, moving with purpose, that easy stride of a child who knows exactly where she is going and is not afraid of anything. He watched as she grew smaller with the distance. He watched until she looked completely fine. Until everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to look on a normal sunny Friday morning. Then he went back inside. He did not know it yet. He could not have known. But the moment he turned away from that door was the last time Harold Harrington would ever see his daughter alive. At 9:25 that morning, a neighbor spotted Gretchen near the intersection of Lawrence Road and Sussex Boulevard. She was close to the church now. Almost there. The neighbor would later describe her as determined and focused, a little girl who knew exactly where she was going. That is the last confirmed sighting of Gretchen Harrington. Somewhere between that intersection and the church, in the final stretch of a walk she had made 4 times that week without incident, something happened. Investigators who arrived later found no signs of a struggle anywhere along that route. No disturbance in the ground. No trace of anything. The trail simply ended partway up that hill, as if Gretchen had quietly stepped out of the world. Which means she almost certainly got into a vehicle without a fight. Without a scream. Without leaving a single mark on the world behind her. Which means she was not afraid. Which means she knew the person behind the wheel. Around 11 o'clock that morning, a group of Gretchen's friends appeared at the Harrington front door. They were looking for her, assuming she had already come home early. She had not. Harold felt the first cold wave of alarm move through him. He called Trinity Church. Spoke to the pastor's wife. Asked whether Gretchen had made it to class that morning. She had not. No one had seen her. Harold searched Lawrence Road himself. He checked the surrounding streets. He walked toward Darby Creek. He backtracked toward the church. He covered every inch of the route she should have taken. Nothing. At 11:23 that morning, Marple Township Police received a missing persons report. And here is where this case takes a turn. A quiet turn, almost invisible at the time, a turn that investigators would note and then, inexplicably, fail to act on for nearly 5 decades. The man who made that call was someone this community trusted completely. He was a fixture in their world. A man of standing. A man of faith. By his own account, he told police he had never seen Gretchen that morning. Said she simply never showed up to camp. He had no information. He was just calling to report her missing. And then he described her clothing. In detail. The color of her shorts. The zipper. The snap closure at the front. The pockets on each side. The absence of visible buttons. Stop and think about what that means. These were not off-the-rack clothes from a department store. These were handmade clothes. Aina had cut the fabric and stitched them herself by hand. That specific combination of details, the zipper, the snap, the pockets, the absence of buttons, that is not information you carry in your memory. That is information that lives in your eyes. Because you were close enough to see it. Close enough to see it clearly. That same morning. Investigators quietly circled his name at the top of their list. And then, for reasons that were never fully explained, they left it there for decades without acting on it. By Saturday morning, Brummel had transformed overnight. A town that had never needed to be afraid was now running on pure panic. More than 400 volunteers flooded the streets, neighbors, firefighters, church members, strangers who had heard the news on the radio and driven in from surrounding counties specifically to help. A Pennsylvania State Police helicopter swept continuously overhead. K-9 bloodhound units were deployed. Volunteer firefighters waded through Darby Creek. Search teams pushed through nearly 2 feet of dense underbrush across more than 5 square miles of terrain. They found nothing. But it was the dogs that told the real story. Trained bloodhounds can follow a scent trail across hours, across rain, across brutal terrain. They are remarkably reliable, and investigators trust them for good reason. These dogs found nothing past a certain point on Lawrence Road. No trail. No disturbance. No sign of a struggle. The scent simply stopped, clean, sudden, final, as if the earth itself had swallowed her. When the dogs went quiet and stood still on that hill, the nature of the search changed. Everyone present understood what it meant, even if they could not yet say it out loud. This was not a child who had wandered off into the woods. This was not an accident near the creek. Whatever had happened to Gretchen Harrington had happened fast and quietly and with her willing cooperation, which meant she had not been afraid. Not at first. Inside the Harrington home, Harold waited. Baby Jessica cried the way newborns cry, thin and insistent, filling every corner of every room. And underneath that sound sat a silence that grew heavier by the hour. One daughter had arrived that morning full of new life. One daughter had vanished into nothing. The same house held both of those truths at the same time and could not make sense of either one. A 24-hour hotline was established. In the first days alone, it received more than 200 calls. Tips came flooding in: a green station wagon near the church, a battered pickup truck parked halfway up the hill toward Trinity Chapel, a white compact car on Lawrence Road. Multiple vehicles. Multiple descriptions. The picture kept shifting until the sheer weight of conflicting information became its own kind of dead end. But one detail kept coming back. The green station wagon. Multiple witnesses, independently, without coordinating with each other, reported a green station wagon parked or moving near a young girl close to Trinity Chapel on the morning of August the 15th. Not a pickup. Not a sedan. A green station wagon. That detail was logged, noted, and then buried under everything else. By Sunday, just 48 hours into the search, Police Chief Daniel Hennessy stood in front of reporters and said the words that landed on that community like a verdict. "We have not got a clue. Not a confirmed lead. Not a suspect they could pin anything on. Nothing." The large-scale search was officially called off. And the town adapted the way frightened communities always do, quietly, practically, and devastatingly. A Bible school classmate of Gretchen's, the same age, from the same neighborhood, after Gretchen disappeared, her mother took her to the hairdresser and had her long hair cut off. Cut short enough that she would look like a boy. The thinking behind that was simple and it was heartbreaking. A girl with long hair was a target. Change her shape so the danger passes her by. That is what Gretchen's disappearance did to Brummel. It did not just frighten parents. It made them start disguising their daughters. 60 days passed. On the 14th of October, 1975, a Navy seaman out jogging through the trails of Ridley Creek State Park stopped on a path and looked down at something that did not belong in those woods. He was not sure what he was looking at, not at first. The area was dense, remote, the kind of place that required real deliberate effort to reach. You did not end up there by accident. Whoever had been there had chosen to go there. He ran to find a park ranger. What investigators found when they arrived at that small clearing, 2.5 miles from where Gretchen was last seen alive, would stay with every single one of them for the rest of their lives. Gretchen's remains were there. 60 days in the October woods. But it was the clothing that told a story that nobody at that scene could explain. Her blouse, the one Anna had sewn by hand, was folded neatly and placed carefully beside her body. Her shoes were on the ground nearby. And her underwear had been hung from a tree branch directly above the scene. The original 1975 Philadelphia Inquirer described it as hung like a flag, as if to call attention to the place. Think about what that means. This was not a crime of rage that simply ended and left chaos behind. Someone had stayed at that scene long enough to arrange things. To fold a child's clothing with deliberate care. To hang something from a branch with unmistakable intent. Whether it was ritual, compulsion, or something else entirely, it pointed without question to a controlled and deliberate mind. Someone who felt, in some unreachable part of themselves, that what they were doing had a kind of order to it. That detail would haunt investigators for decades. Harold and Anna were brought to the police. They were shown the clothing found at the scene. Harold looked at the fabric. The stitching. The specific way everything had been made by hand, details that only Anna's hands could have created. And he said, "There is absolutely no doubt. It was hers." Dental records confirmed it. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. 2 or more severe impacts to the skull. A depressed fracture. The kind of force that does not happen by accident. Gretchen Harrington had been killed deliberately. Her body had been carried 2.5 miles into the woods. Her clothing had been arranged with unsettling precision. And then the person who did all of that walked back out into the world. 5 days later, on a Sunday morning, Harold Harrington stood at his church pulpit. His congregation sat in complete silence. And Harold, a man who had just identified his 8-year-old daughter through her dental records, spoke these words. "Gretchen, with her simple faith, is free. But her killer is in terrible bondage." A few days after that, the funeral was held. The community gathered to say goodbye to a little girl who had loved Gunsmoke and worn mismatched clothes and been everybody's instant friend. And leading that service, offering comfort, praying over Gretchen's coffin, standing at the podium and guiding a grieving community through their darkest moment, was the man who 2 months earlier had described her handmade shorts in precise detail despite claiming he had never once seen her that morning. He stood at that podium. He prayed. He comforted Harold. He comforted Anna. He was exactly what everyone in that room needed him to be, the pastor, the family friend, the steady and trusted pillar of their community. And not one person in that room had any reason to look at him differently than they ever had. That is the part of this story that is hardest to sit with. Not just what happened to Gretchen in those woods. But what happened after. The composed face at the funeral. The steady voice at the pulpit. The man who helped organize the search, who called the police himself, who brought his wife over to deliver dinner to the Harrington home that very night, all while knowing exactly where she was. That is who was standing at that pulpit. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment right now. Let us see who is actually following this case. Tell us, do you think the right man was ever charged? Because what comes next changes everything, and we want to know where you stand before we get there. The investigation that followed the discovery of Gretchen's body was intense but short-lived. Police interviewed everyone connected to the area where she was found. Tips flooded in again. One name that came up seriously was a convicted child rapist and kidnapper who had been seen less than a mile from where Gretchen disappeared on the morning she vanished. He was investigated, but his DNA was never compared to evidence from the scene. The case against him never solidified. He eventually died in a state prison decades later without ever being charged in Gretchen's case. The other leads dissolved one by one. And the evidence box at Marple Township Police Department headquarters, full of reel-to-reel interview tapes, crime scene photographs, memos, and witness statements, began to gather dust. Detectives would pull it out occasionally, go through the files looking for the thing everyone before them had missed, put it back frustrated, and move on. The original lead detective retired. Then died. The case moved from desk to desk like something nobody wanted to own and nobody could bring themselves to release. Years passed. Then decades. But in a house about 3 miles east of Brummel, a woman had been holding on to something since 1975. Something she had written down as a 10-year-old girl in a childhood diary. In the careful handwriting of someone who had seen something wrong and had absolutely no one safe to tell. She had kept that diary for 48 years. And she still had it. In October of 2022, 2 journalists, both Brummel natives who had grown up in the shadow of Gretchen's disappearance, published a book about the case. One of them had been 9 years old when Gretchen vanished. She remembered the helicopter circling overhead. She remembered what the streets felt like when they went quiet. The book was not written to sensationalize anything. It was written because someone needed to keep asking the question. And it worked. Old memories surfaced. Old fears came back up. And somewhere in Pennsylvania, a woman read something, or heard something, that finally pushed her past a line she had been standing behind for nearly half a century. In the fall of 2022, a sergeant at the Marple Township Police Department found a voicemail waiting on his desk. A woman wanted to talk about Gretchen Harrington. She said she thought she knew who was responsible. She said she had information about an attempted kidnapping from the same period. She said she had a diary from 1975. She still had it. On the 2nd of January, 2023, Pennsylvania state troopers sat down with the woman, identified in court documents only by her initials. She was now in her late 50s. She had lived with what she knew for 48 years. And she had finally chosen to say it out loud. She had grown up in Havertone, about 3 miles from Brummel. She had been a schoolmate of Gretchen and her older sister. She had also been close friends with the daughters of a man named David Zanstra, a pastor in the community. She spent time at the Zanstra home regularly. She slept over there often. And then she told investigators what had happened during 2 of those sleepovers. She was 10 years old. She and Zanstra's daughter had gone to bed. In the middle of the night, she woke up and found David Zanstra in the room, acting inappropriately. He shifted her body and left immediately, fast, practiced, like someone who knew exactly what he was doing and exactly when to stop. She told herself it was strange. She told herself it was probably nothing. And then it happened again the very next night. Same darkness. Same deliberate movement. Same immediate retreat the moment she stirred. The next morning, she told Zanstra's daughter what had happened, both nights. And that girl, his own child, looked at her and said something she never forgot. Not in 48 years of carrying it. He does that sometimes. Some nights I hear my sister crying. Sit with that for a moment. A child telling another child that her father's nighttime behavior was so routine, so established, that it had its own tired and resigned acknowledgement in the household. No alarm. No surprise. No one calling for help. Just a little girl who had learned to sleep lightly, telling her friend that this was simply how things were. The witness went home and told her parents. They banned her from the Zanstra house immediately. No formal complaint to police. No public accusation. This was 1975. He was a pastor. He was respected. Who in that world was going to believe a 10-year-old girl over a man of God? 1 week later, Gretchen Harrington disappeared. She carried that knowledge from childhood into adolescence, into adulthood, into middle age. She carried it through every development in the case, through every decade of silence, through every year that passed without an answer. She had written it down at the time, in the only way a 10-year-old knows how to hold something too heavy to carry alone, in her diary. Now she placed that diary on the table in front of the state troopers. Worn edges. Pages yellowed by 5 decades of time. The careful handwriting of a child still learning to form her letters. She turned to the entry dated the 15th of September, 1975. 1 month after Gretchen vanished. 2 weeks before her body would be found. And she read it aloud. Guess what? A man tried to kidnap Holly twice. It is a secret, so I cannot tell anyone. But I think he might be the one who kidnapped Gretchen. I think it was Mr. Z. A 10-year-old girl in 1975, with no forensic training, no detective experience, no power of any kind, had written down the name of the man she believed had taken her friend. She had written it because she had no one safe to tell. She had written it and she had kept it. 48 years in a drawer. In a box. In whatever corner of her life she had tucked away the things she could not speak out loud. In legal terms, what investigators were now holding was a contemporaneous record, written at the time, by a witness with direct knowledge, before any arrest, before any trial, before anyone in the world had a reason to fabricate anything. That kind of evidence cannot be created after the fact. A child had documented her suspicion in real time, and that document had survived intact for nearly half a century. The net was closing. Marietta, Georgia sits northwest of Atlanta. Quiet. Comfortable. The kind of retirement town where people go to disappear into a slower version of their lives. David Zandstra had been there for years. He and his wife Margaret had a lakefront home, peaceful, private, very far from a wooded hillside in Delaware County, Pennsylvania. He was 83 years old. He still carried himself like a pastor. He still spoke with the measured confidence of a man who had spent his entire life being trusted and believed. On the 17th of July, 2023, 2 Pennsylvania State Police troopers flew to Georgia. They came without handcuffs. No weapons drawn. They had arranged to meet Zandstra at the Cobb County Police Department at his convenience, at a time that worked for him. Their stated purpose was simple: a DNA swab. Just a conversation. Just a formality. What they were actually doing was closing a door that had been open for 48 years. The interview started the way Zandstra clearly expected it to. He was sharp, impressively, almost unsettlingly sharp. He recalled the names of churches he had served in the 1960s without hesitation. He named towns, dates, congregation details across 6 full decades of ministry with the ease of someone who had organized his memories carefully and kept them close. At one point, when the corporal got a detail slightly wrong, Zandstra corrected him without missing a beat. This was not a confused old man. Then the corporal shifted the conversation to the 15th of August, 1975. The ease evaporated. Zandstra's demeanor changed in a way that was visible but carefully managed. He did not panic. He leaned on age. "My brain is 83 years old," he said. "You are throwing a lot of stuff at me. You are asking me questions I am unsure of." The same man who had just corrected a trained investigator on a factual detail was now uncertain. The man who could recall every church he had ever served across 6 decades suddenly could not quite place what had happened on one specific morning nearly 50 years ago. He denied seeing Gretchen. Denied any involvement. The same account he had given in August 1975. In October 1975. For 48 years in between. The corporal let him finish. Then he told Zandstra about the woman who had come forward. The childhood friend of his daughter. The sleepovers. What she said had happened in the night. What his own daughter had said in response. And something in David Zandstra's face shifted. Not dramatically. Not the way it happens in a movie. It was smaller than that. A settling. A slight deflation. As if something he had been holding upright for a very long time had quietly gotten too heavy to hold anymore. He started to talk. Slowly at first. Haltingly. Words coming out of order, circling back, stopping and starting again. He said he saw her that morning. Walking up the hill alone. He recognized her immediately. She was his neighbor's daughter, his own daughter's friend, a child he had known for years. He pulled up beside her in his green AMC Rambler station wagon and offered her a ride to church. She accepted without hesitation. Of course she did. She knew him. He did not drive her to church. He drove her to a secluded section of Ridley Creek State Park. She was terrified on that drive. She begged him to turn around. Pleaded with him to take her home. Told him she just wanted to go back. He kept driving. And then, in the confession that the trooper present would later say came out with something resembling relief, not remorse, not grief, but relief, Zandstra said he struck her in the head with a rock. He checked for a pulse. He could not find one. He covered her body with sticks and branches and left. Then he drove back to the church and went about his day. When the investigators pressed him, "Why, how could you, what were you thinking?" Zandstra reached for the only framework his entire life had ever been built on. He said that like King David, his biblical namesake, he had sinned. And through confession, he would find forgiveness. He had killed an 8-year-old girl. Carried her body into the woods. Stood at her funeral. Prayed over her coffin. Watched her family grieve for 48 years. And he was framing it as a spiritual transaction. The trooper said afterward, "I do not know if he was sorry for what he did. What I do know is this. It looked like a weight coming off his shoulders." The corporal had to borrow a laptop from a local officer right there in that room to draft the affidavit of probable cause. He had not come to Georgia with an arrest warrant. Nobody had expected a confession. The paperwork that needed to exist simply did not exist yet. David Zandstra was taken into custody that same day. 1 week later, the Delaware County District Attorney stood at a podium before cameras and said what Brummel had been waiting nearly 5 decades to hear. David Zandstra is every parent's worst nightmare. He killed this poor 8-year-old girl, a girl he knew, a girl who trusted him. And then he acted as if he was a family friend. Not only during her burial, but for years. The community exhaled. They had absolutely no idea what was coming. January 2025. David Zandstra, now 84 years old, sat at the defense table and pleaded not guilty. The same man who had sat in a Georgia police station 18 months earlier and described in his own words driving an 8-year-old girl into the woods was now saying it never happened. That what the troopers had recorded was not a confession. It was a confused old man being pushed past his limits by investigators who had come with an agenda already decided. The defense attorney laid out the argument with precision. His client was not a calculating killer who had finally been caught after half a century. He was an 83-year-old stroke survivor diagnosed with vascular dementia, a progressive condition that impairs memory and judgment and, critically, the ability to resist suggestion. He had been subjected to a 4-hour interview in an unfamiliar police building far from home, with no attorney present. The investigators had presented themselves as friendly, as just wanting a conversation, and then had systematically worked to dismantle an elderly man's grip on reality. Then the defense called the lead investigator to the stand. On cross-examination, he acknowledged what the defense had been methodically building toward. He had lied to Zandstra during the interview. He had told Zandstra that a witness had specifically identified his green Rambler approaching Gretchen on the morning she disappeared. That was not true. Witnesses had reported a Rambler, but none had identified it as belonging to Zandstra. He had told Zandstra that police had recovered rocks from the crime scene with blood on them. Also not true. There were rocks. There was no blood. These are legal interrogation tactics in the United States. They are commonly used, designed to make a subject believe the evidence against them is far stronger than it actually is. But stated plainly in a courtroom, under oath, they sounded like something else entirely. They sounded like two investigators constructing a reality around a vulnerable and compromised old man until he began to believe he belonged inside it. Then came the DNA. Forensic testing on Gretchen's clothing had identified biological material belonging to 3 separate individuals, 2 unidentified men and 1 unidentified woman. None of them were David Zandstra. He was not a contributor. Not even a partial match. He was entirely excluded from all 3 profiles. 3 unknown DNA profiles. On the clothing of a murdered 8-year-old girl. Still unmatched. Still unidentified. Belonging to people whose names nobody knows to this day. The prosecution pushed back hard. The deputy district attorney argued that Zandstra had recalled details during his confession that only the actual killer could have known, that Gretchen had been terrified on the drive, that she had begged him to take her home, that he had struck her with a rock and covered her body with branches. Details, he argued, that do not come from suggestion. Details that come from memory. But the damage was done. On the 17th of January, 2025, the jury began deliberating. 1 hour later, they came back. Not guilty. On all counts. David Zandstra stood up from the defense table and hugged his attorney. His family gathered around him. After a 4-day trial and 48 years of unanswered questions, he was going home. Within months of returning to his lakefront house in Georgia, David Zandstra was dead. He was 85 years old. His cancer, which had been in remission before his arrest, had returned during his time in custody and gone untreated. In January of 2026, his family filed a federal lawsuit naming both investigating troopers as defendants, alleging that they had illegally coerced a confession from a stroke survivor with dementia, and that his cancer had returned and killed him while he was wrongfully incarcerated. The plaintiff was Margaret Zandstra, the same woman who had brought a home-cooked dinner to the Harrington family on the night Gretchen disappeared. Now filing legal paperwork on behalf of her husband's estate, seeking damages for what she called an extreme and immoral prosecution. The man who confessed is dead. The alternate suspect died in state prison decades ago. The 3 DNA profiles on Gretchen's clothing remain unmatched in any criminal database anywhere in the country. The Pennsylvania State Police have stated the investigation is closed. There are no announced plans to reopen it. Gretchen Harrington remains, officially, unsolved. She never got her perfect attendance certificate. That is what she was walking toward that morning. A small piece of paper. A simple recognition of the fact that she had shown up every single day without fail. She was 8 years old. Bible in hand. Striped shirt with plaid pants, because she genuinely did not care about matching and never had. Moving up that hill with the kind of easy certainty that only children who feel completely safe in the world can carry with them. 50 years later, 3 unknown DNA profiles sit in a database with no names attached. A diary written by a 10-year-old girl in the careful handwriting of a child who had no one safe to tell. That diary was the closest thing to justice this case ever produced. And somewhere in Ridley Creek State Park, in the memory of every investigator and volunteer and parent who walked those woods in October of 1975, a piece of clothing still hangs from a branch. Exactly the way the newspaper described it. Like a flag. As if calling attention to a place where someone left a child and walked away. And has never once been held accountable. If you know anything at all, about what happened to Gretchen Harrington, the Pennsylvania State Police tip line is still active. Justice does not have an expiration date. For Gretchen, it is running very, very late. And that is exactly why Cold Case Vault exists. Because every case on this channel represents a family that is still waiting. A name that deserves to be spoken out loud. A story that deserves to be told until someone, somewhere, finally comes forward. 50 years. A childhood diary. A confession recorded in a borrowed room. A not guilty verdict delivered in under 60 minutes. And 3 DNA profiles sitting in a database with no names, no faces, and no accountability attached to them. If this case stayed with you, and we believe it will, share it. Send it to someone who needs to hear Gretchen's name. Drop your thoughts in the comments below because we read every single one, and this is a conversation that needs to keep going. If you are not already subscribed to Cold Case Vault, right now is the moment. Hit subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss a case. We are here every week, doing the research, telling these stories the way they deserve to be told, because every victim deserves at least that much. We will see you in the next case.